I suppose every betrayal begins with something that doesn't look like betrayal at all. A glance, a smile, a sentence that lingers just a second too long. That's how it began for me. Not in darkness or secrecy, but in broad daylight, in a warm, overlit hotel lobby in Charleston. I had been married to Andrew for 31 years at that point. He was a good man. Still is, I suppose. Steady, reliable, a creature of habit with a fondness for planning everything down to the minute. He flossed twice a day. He balanced our budget like it was a sacred text. And every Sunday morning, he made scrambled eggs and read the paper, humming the same tune, something classical I could never name. But I was 57. Something had begun shifting inside me, quietly, slowly. Not a crisis, not a collapse, but a kind of drifting. Andrew didn't notice. Or if he did, he mistook it for menopause or boredom or simply the season. We still made love, once or twice a month, in the same rhythm, the same position, the same sigh at the end. I didn't dislike it. I just wasn't there. Charleston was supposed to be a reset. His idea. 4 days in a charming old hotel, walking the cobblestone streets, eating she crab soup, and looking at antebellum houses with Spanish moss dripping from the trees. We were walking clichés. I was wearing linen. He had a sun hat. We took pictures of fountains and posted them to Facebook with captions like, "Loving the Southern charm." It was on the second evening, after a long day of walking and a late lunch, that I found myself alone. Andrew had developed a headache, maybe the heat, he said, rubbing his temple and lying down in the room. I didn't feel like staying inside. The hotel had a rooftop bar, and I thought I'd treat myself to a glass of white wine, maybe read a little. That's where I met him. He was sitting alone, wearing a white button-down shirt open at the collar, a dark blazer, and tortoiseshell reading glasses. He looked like someone who used to be a professor and then got bored of academia. Silver in his hair, but it suited him. Something about his face made me pause, a ruggedness that wasn't trying too hard, a stillness that contrasted with the hum of tourists and clinking glasses. I sat 3 stools away, and when the bartender came over, I ordered a Sauvignon Blanc and opened the book I had brought with me, something by Elena Ferrante I had already read once but wanted to reread. "You're not really reading that," he said, not unkindly, glancing over. I looked at him, amused but cautious. "Excuse me? You're pretending. You're holding the book like a shield." I laughed, half nervous, half delighted by the nerve. "And you're an expert in female body language?" "No," he said. "I'm an expert in pretending not to feel lonely." It was such a simple thing to say, but it broke something open in me. We talked for 40 minutes. Then an hour. Then another drink. He told me his name was Julian. He used to work in design, home interiors mostly. Now he did consulting work, occasionally gave lectures on aesthetics and emotional space. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I nodded, intrigued. He asked me about my life, and I told him in vague terms, retired early from teaching, married, no kids. He nodded like he already knew. "You have the look," he said. "What look?" "Women who wanted more but convinced themselves it was enough." I should have gotten up then. I should have taken my book and gone back down to our room, kissed Andrew's forehead, and told him I was tired too. But I didn't. I stayed. And the conversation turned. He asked if I'd ever been truly desired, not just loved, not just appreciated, but wanted in a way that left no room for doubt. I said I didn't know. He said, "You would know if you had." The air between us was shifting, thickening. Every time our eyes met, it lingered. When I laughed, I touched his arm. When he leaned in, I didn't pull back. When his hand brushed mine as he reached for his drink, I let it rest. Eventually, I stood up and said I should go. He said, "You should. But you won't." I looked at him. "And why is that?" "Because you haven't felt like this in years." He was right. But I did leave. I went back to the room, quietly undressed in the dim light, slid into bed next to Andrew. He didn't wake up. He never did. I stared at the ceiling, heart still thudding, the ghost of Julian's voice echoing in my ear. The next morning, I walked the market by myself. bought some handmade soaps, and a ceramic mug. Around noon, Andrew said he felt better. We took a carriage ride and listened to a college student tell us about history and hurricanes. I smiled, held his hand, played the part. But I kept thinking about the night before. I went back to the bar that evening, alone. Julian was there, waiting. I knew you'd come. This time we didn't talk as much. There was a quietness between us that was almost more intimate than words. He told me I looked beautiful in blue. I told him he was dangerous. He leaned in and said, "Only if you want me to be." We left together. His room was 2 floors above mine. It was larger, more tastefully decorated. He had music playing, something jazzy and slow. He poured me a glass of wine but set it down before I could drink it. His hands were on my face, my neck, his mouth on mine, and I responded, hungrily, as if something inside me had been waiting years to be woken. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't crude. But it was urgent. His hands knew how to touch. Not groping, not impatient, but exploratory, appreciative. As if he were discovering something valuable and rare. My blouse slipped off my shoulders. His fingers slid beneath my bra strap. I didn't resist. We made love on the bed, with the curtain still open. I could see the tops of the buildings, the darkening sky. He whispered things I hadn't heard in decades, not obscene but reverent. Like he was worshipping not just my body, but something deeper, something I had forgotten I even had. Afterward, we lay tangled together. I didn't ask what this meant. I didn't ask what would happen tomorrow. I just lay there, bare-skinned and breathing, feeling more alive than I had in years. I went back to my room past midnight. Andrew was asleep. Again. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. There was a glow to my skin, a softness in my eyes. I didn't feel guilty. I felt reborn. And that, I think, was the beginning of the end, or maybe the start of something else entirely. The strange thing about infidelity, at least for me, is how quickly it begins to feel like routine. Not just the act, but the hiding, the compartmentalizing, the decisions you make in quiet half moments. A glance at the clock. The way you silence a text notification. The stories you half prepare in your mind, just in case. Julian and I didn't become lovers in a blaze of reckless passion that burned itself out. Ours was slower, measured, like 2 people learning a language together. Every encounter deepened the vocabulary. That Charleston night didn't end it. It started it. The next morning, over breakfast with Andrew in the hotel's sunny little courtyard, I sat across from my husband, watching him stir 2 packets of sugar into his coffee, fold his napkin neatly across his lap, and I felt an ache. Not of guilt, of distance. Like I was watching a life I had inhabited for so long suddenly become foreign. It was the same table, the same man, the same conversation about headlines and hotel Wi-Fi, but I was no longer fully there. Julian texted me later that day, short and simple. "Want to take a walk?" I shouldn't have said yes. I should have deleted the message and smiled at Andrew and suggested we take a boat tour or visit another museum. Instead, I told Andrew I wanted to have a quiet afternoon to journal and be alone with my thoughts. He nodded, grateful for the time to read by the pool. Julian and I met by the water, near the Battery, where the wind picked up from the harbor and whipped my hair back. We walked slowly, deliberately. No hand-holding, no gestures that would draw attention. But our bodies tilted toward each other with an ease I hadn't felt since my 20s. He talked about spaces. About how people live in rooms that don't reflect who they are, and how intimacy is a kind of architecture. I didn't pretend to understand all of it, but the way he said it made me feel like I did. We stopped beneath a live oak, its thick branches curling like something mythic. And there, in the middle of a public park, he looked at me and said, "You don't have to go back to sleep." I asked what he meant. He said, "I think you were sleepwalking through your life. And now you're waking up." I kissed him. Not the hungry kiss of the night before, but something slower, fuller. A kiss with memory. He pulled me close, his hands warm on the small of my back, and I let my eyes drift shut. There were people nearby, tourists, joggers, strollers. But in that moment, I felt invisible, or maybe unafraid. That night, I didn't sleep with Julian. We just talked. Sat in his room with a bottle of wine, our legs tangled on the couch, and told stories we'd never told anyone. I told him about a piano teacher I had loved at 17. He told me about a marriage that ended not in drama but silence. And slowly, the line between him and Andrew, between my old self and whatever this was becoming, began to blur. When we flew home 2 days later, everything felt smaller. The house, our town, the rhythm of our days. Andrew seemed content, maybe even pleased with how the trip had gone. I pretended to agree. But inside me, something had shifted irrevocably. Julian didn't disappear. We kept in touch. He lived in Atlanta, which wasn't far, a few hours' drive. He invited me down under the pretense of a gallery opening, and I went. Then again for a lecture he was giving at a university. The excuses were easy to invent. A visit to an old friend.
A solo weekend retreat.
Andrew, always trusting, never asked much. Or maybe he didn't want to. Julian's apartment was minimalist, filled with light and strange textures, smooth wood, velvet, glass. Everything about the space felt curated, sensual, without being indulgent. I became familiar with the scent of his soap, the way his sheets felt cool at first but warmed quickly. We'd wake early, tangled together, and he'd make coffee with a French press, handing me a mug before saying a word. I loved the quiet of it, the stillness. With Andrew, our life was filled with schedules and practicalities. With Julian, time softened. We never once discussed what we were doing. We didn't define it. And maybe that was the point. The sex was different too. I hadn't expected that. I had thought, maybe foolishly, that by this point in life, things became rote, bodies less responsive, desires dulled. But with Julian, it was the opposite. He noticed things. The way I arched slightly if his hand moved a certain way. The shiver that ran down me when he kissed the inside of my wrist. He used his mouth like it was an extension of thought, slow, intentional, with purpose. And I responded. I rediscovered sounds I hadn't made in years. I remembered what it felt like to be watched undressing, not as a routine, but as a kind of ceremony. He told me I was beautiful without makeup, without angles. He ran his hands over my stomach, my thighs, my back, like they weren't flaws but maps to something sacred. Once, after we'd made love in the shower, water still running down our skin, I stood facing the mirror, toweling my hair, and he came behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and said, "You don't know what you've awakened." I looked at our reflection, his chin resting on my shoulder, my face flushed, lips slightly parted, and I didn't recognize myself. Not in a frightening way, in a thrilling one. Back home, life resumed. But now I was split. Two lives running parallel, touching only in memory. Andrew remained himself, kind, methodical, a little oblivious. We shared dinners and routine evenings. We watched shows on Netflix and commented on the weather. But my mind wandered. I found myself drifting during conversations, catching myself staring out windows, fingers tracing the rim of a wine glass as I remembered the way Julian had kissed my neck in the middle of a sentence. There were times I told myself I should end it, that I was being selfish, unfair. But then, I'd think, what had been fair about the last 15 years? About living like I was folded in half, smiling through a fog of quiet dissatisfaction? Julian didn't demand anything. He never asked me to leave Andrew. Never made promises, or tried to claim more than I gave. Maybe that's why it continued, because it wasn't about escaping my marriage. It was about finding a part of myself I'd buried. One morning, back at home, I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the sunrise. The dogwood tree was beginning to bloom. Andrew was inside, fixing something in the garage. I heard the clink of tools, the low hum of the radio. I thought about all the mornings we had shared like this. The ordinary beauty of it. And I felt love. Not the burning kind, not the desperate kind, but the enduring one. The kind that's built over decades. Through routines and disappointments and quiet companionship. And I also felt something else. Something wild and alive and selfish and real. I didn't want to choose. I wanted both, the comfort and the fire. the husband who brought me tea when I had a cold, and the man who traced poetry along my spine with his fingertips. And for a while, I had both. But I knew that couldn't last forever. Something eventually would have to break. It was in early November, right as the leaves in our neighborhood turned that amber shade I always associated with comfort, that something inside me began to shift again. But this time, it wasn't awakening, it was unease. Julian and I had been seeing each other for nearly 6 months by then. I had driven to Atlanta 4 times, and he had come to me twice. Once under the pretext of a design consultation with a local firm, once to reconnect with a former colleague. He never stayed at our house, of course. We met in boutique hotels, mostly, the kind with white sheets, heavy curtains, and overpriced mini bars. Each encounter was more intense than the last, not just physically, but emotionally. There was a moment, I remember it vividly, when I was lying across his chest, tracing the light patch of hair there with my fingertip, and he said, softly, "I think I could fall in love with you." I froze. Not out of fear, but because I realized I had already fallen. It wasn't a dramatic thing. No thunderclap, no swelling music. Just a slow, steady erosion of barriers. A sinking into something that felt inevitable. Back home, I noticed myself becoming more careful. Andrew had grown more attentive. Not suspicious, just present in a way I hadn't expected. He started cooking more elaborate dinners, suggested weekend getaways, asked questions about my days with genuine interest. Maybe he sensed something. Or maybe he was simply remembering how to try. And that, more than anything, confused me. Because I didn't want him to be the villain. I didn't want this to be a story where I was escaping some cold, neglectful husband. Andrew wasn't cruel. He was kind. He was dependable. He folded laundry without being asked and remembered to refill the bird feeder and always warmed my side of the bed in winter. He loved me. I knew that. But there was something in Julian that stirred me. Not just lust, but attention. He looked at me like I was still becoming something, not something settled and known. He listened as if my thoughts carried weight, even when I rambled about old memories or the books I never finished. One afternoon, in early December, I stood in front of the mirror and studied myself. Naked.
No makeup.
Hair still damp from the shower. I looked older than I felt inside, faint lines around the eyes, softness around the middle. But I also looked real. Lived in. And for the first time in years, I saw that as beautiful. Julian had something to do with that. But so did I. That night, Andrew made chicken piccata and opened a bottle of wine. We listened to an old jazz album, the kind we used to dance to in our 30s, and he pulled me into the living room, one hand on my waist. We swayed gently, and I rested my head against his shoulder, and for a brief moment, I imagined telling him everything. Not in cruelty.
Not in shame.
But in truth.
I didn't.
Instead, I cried quietly in the bathroom after he'd fallen asleep. Not because I regretted what I was doing, but because I knew I couldn't keep living in between. The next weekend, I told Julian I needed space. He didn't protest. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just said, "I was wondering when you'd say that." We didn't talk for 12 days. In that time, I threw myself into things.
Cleaned out the attic.
Went through old photo albums. Attended 2 yoga classes. Spent a whole afternoon baking bread from scratch just to keep my hands busy. And still I thought of him. Every time I heard my phone vibrate, my heart raced. Every time I passed the hotel where we first met, I felt an ache. I tried to reignite something with Andrew, I really did. I initiated sex one night, and he was pleasantly surprised, even flattered. But halfway through, I closed my eyes and imagined Julian's hands instead. And that, more than anything, broke something in me. I called Julian 2 days later. "I can't do this halfway," I said. He was quiet. Then, "I don't want halfway." So we saw each other again. This time in Savannah, neutral ground. A city wrapped in beauty, with just enough secrecy in its twisting streets and Spanish moss to make it feel like our own. We stayed in a bed and breakfast with creaky floors and antique mirrors and a clawfoot tub I sat in while he poured water slowly over my shoulders. It was the most romantic weekend of my life. And yet, when I returned home, I felt hollow. Andrew greeted me at the door with a warm hug and asked how my women's retreat had gone.
Elite.
I told him it was restorative. I smiled and handed him the lavender soap I had picked up as a souvenir. That night, I lay awake next to him, wide-eyed, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling the pressure of two worlds pulling in opposite directions. Julian had said, "I think you're afraid of becoming your mother." It had caught me off guard. But he was right. My mother, dutiful, gentle, deeply polite, had lived her entire life inside the walls of someone else's expectations. She had loved my father with a kind of quiet desperation, even when he grew distant in his later years. She never traveled without him, never took up painting like she used to dream of, never said no, never said yes for her own sake. And in the end, she withered. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, and she looked at me and said, "Don't wait until it's too late." I didn't know what she meant then. I think I do now. Because what no one tells you is that love and betrayal can live in the same breath. That you can be grateful for one person and still crave another. That you can want to protect the life you built, while yearning to burn it all down for the thrill of starting again. I didn't know who I was becoming. But I knew I couldn't go back. And someone was going to get hurt. Spring came late that year, almost hesitant, like it was unsure of its welcome. The daffodils bloomed in fits, the air still held a bite well into April, and I lived with the growing sense that my life was balancing on a wire stretched taut between two men. I saw Julian one more time before everything changed. We met in Asheville this time, halfway between our lives. Between who I had been and who I was trying to become. The hotel was modest, unremarkable. A fireplace in the corner, old pine furniture, a bed that creaked when we moved. But the moment I walked in, set my bag down, and turned to see him standing there, I felt everything that had been missing for years. That night was different. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't passionate in the frantic way new affairs can be. It was reverent. Every movement was intentional, unspoken, an echo of every touch we had shared before. He undressed me like someone handling a beloved book, gently, carefully, and with the weight of memory. I cried just a little after I came, not because I was sad, but because I realized fully I was losing something. Something either way. We lay in bed afterward, limbs tangled, his hand resting low on my stomach. "I want more than this," he said. "Not needy. Just honest." I didn't answer. I pressed my forehead to his chest and listened to his heartbeat instead. In the morning, we drank coffee in silence. He kissed me at the door, once long and slow, and said, "Whatever you choose, I want you to mean it." And I drove home, the highway unfolding like a quiet threat beneath my tires. That night, back in our house, Andrew was making lasagna. The smell of garlic and basil filled the kitchen. He had poured wine for both of us. He wore an apron I'd bought him 3 Christmases ago with a joke about grilling on it. And for a moment, I hated him for being so safe, for being here, for making it harder. We ate dinner in near silence. At one point, he looked up at me, really looked, and said, "You've been different." I opened my mouth to lie, but the words didn't come. So I nodded instead. And then he said something I will never forget. "Are you in love with someone else?" Not angry, not even wounded, just calm, like he'd known for a while, but was waiting to see if I'd ever bring it into the light. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just said, "Yes." He put down his fork, wiped his mouth. "How long?" I told him. Not every detail, but enough.
He didn't yell.
He didn't throw anything. He just sat there, hands folded, looking at the wall for a long time before he finally said, "Is it over?" And I said the only honest thing I could. "I don't know." We didn't sleep in the same bed that night. I sat in the den for hours, watching the digital clock blink, sipping cold tea. When I finally did lie down, it was on the guest bed, under an old quilt I hadn't touched in years. I felt like a child again.
Small.
Uncertain. The next few weeks were a blur. We tried to talk. Some days we succeeded. Other days we fought. Quietly, always quietly. No plates thrown, no slammed doors. Just the cold warfare of long-married people who know exactly which silences hurt the most. I didn't see Julian during that time. He respected that, gave me space. But every night, I'd reread old messages, run my fingers over the edges of memories still warm in my skin. I missed him, terribly. But I also missed the way I used to feel when the world was simple. Eventually, Andrew asked me what I wanted. I told him I didn't know. Because I didn't. I loved him. I truly did. But it was a love shaped by decades of routine, of cohabitation and shared burdens. A love of habits. Of knowing the exact sound of his sneeze, the way he always knocked on a bathroom door twice before entering, even when it was clearly empty. But with Julian, it was different. It was hunger and expansion. It was about rediscovery, about the parts of me I thought had died long ago. So I did the only thing I could. I left. Not for Julian. Not right away. Not for anyone. I rented a little cottage on the edge of town. 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping and one for writing, though I mostly filled it with journals and candles and long walks through my own thoughts. I told Andrew I needed time. I told Julian I wasn't ready to make promises. And for the first time in decades, I lived alone.
It was terrifying.
And exhilarating. Some nights I cried. For Andrew.
For the past.
For the life I'd so carefully built only to walk away from it, brick by brick. Other nights I lit a fire, poured a glass of wine, and sat naked in front of the mirror just to remind myself that this body, mine, was still alive. Julian and I stayed in touch. Emails mostly. Thoughtful. Not desperate. He told me about projects, sent pictures of strange art he knew I'd love. He never pushed. And Andrew, well, we found a rhythm. Separate, but not hostile. We still spoke. Shared a bank account. Talked about taxes and the dog we'd shared for 10 years who now lived with him. Sometimes he brought over food. Sometimes I brought over flowers. We were no longer a marriage, but we were still something. 6 months passed.
Then a year.
One warm September evening, I called Julian and asked if he was free. "I'm always free for you," he said quietly. I drove to Atlanta. No pretense. No story. When I got to his door, he looked older.
Softer.
And he didn't ask for explanations. He just kissed me, then stepped aside to let me in. That night, we didn't undress right away. We sat on his couch, holding hands, our legs pressed together, watching the city light up outside the window. We talked about everything and nothing. Then gently he led me to bed. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a beginning either. It was a continuation. An agreement. That we are allowed to want more. Even when we're 50. Even when we've been good, faithful, quiet wives for decades. Even when we're scared. Especially then. And maybe that's what I've learned. That loving someone, truly loving them, doesn't always mean staying. And sometimes, choosing yourself is the bravest, most painful, most honest thing you can do. Even if it breaks your heart a little. Even if it breaks someone else's too. Because the real betrayal isn't in the sex. It's in the silence. In the pretending. In the slow erosion of desire until all that's left is shadow. I chose not to disappear. And that, in the end, was the affair I needed most.